In the bitter winter of 1884, high in the Colorado Rockies, near what would later become the town of Leadville, a widow named Sarah Coleman became the subject of considerable ridicule among her fellow settlers, while neighbors spent their days splitting cord after cord of firewood and chinked their cabin walls with moss and mud against the bone-chilling cold. Sarah had abandoned her small homestead cabin entirely and moved into a limestone cave she'd discovered a half-mile up the mountainside. The other settlers thought she'd lost her mind with grief. Her husband had died in a mining accident the previous spring, and now here she was, talking about living in a hole in the mountain like some kind of animal. They figured the loneliness had driven her to desperation, maybe even madness. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see yet, was that by the time the worst winter in living memory descended upon them, Sarah would be sitting comfortably inside her cave while they burned through their entire winter wood supply by February and huddled together for warmth, wondering how she was even still alive up there. Sarah Coleman wasn't mountain-born. She'd come west from Pennsylvania with her husband Thomas 3 years earlier, following the silver rush like so many others, believing they could carve out something better than the factory life they'd left behind. Thomas had been a carpenter back east, skilled with his hands, and Sarah had worked in her father's general store since she was old enough to count change. They'd staked a claim on a rocky piece of ground about an hour's walk from the nearest neighbor, a German immigrant named Frederick Bauer, who ran a small sawmill. Beyond him, perhaps 2 hours on foot through the timber, lived the Harris family, Samuel and his wife Martha, with their 3 children, who'd been homesteading the area since 1879. The terrain was unforgiving, all steep slopes covered in pine and aspen, with winters that could drop snow deeper than a man's chest and cold that made your teeth ache just from breathing. Most folks built their cabins in the traditional way, stacking logs horizontally with notched corners, filling the gaps with whatever they could find, mud mixed with grass or moss, sometimes rags if they had them, and they'd build the biggest fireplace they could manage, knowing they'd need to keep it roaring from October through April. Even then, you'd wake up to find ice in your water bucket if you let the fire die down in the night. Sarah had watched her first winter here with keen attention, the kind of attention you develop when you're trying to learn how to survive in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. She noticed how the wind would knife through even the best chinked cabin walls, how the heat from the fireplace seemed to rush straight up the chimney and disappear, how Thomas would come in from gathering wood with his hands so cold he couldn't feel his fingers, how they'd go through a stack of firewood that had taken weeks to split in just a matter of days. She noticed how much of their time, nearly all of it really, went into the simple act of staying warm. Cutting wood, splitting wood, stacking wood, feeding the fire, banking the coals, starting it again. It consumed everything. And she noticed something else too, something she mentioned to Thomas one evening in late January of their second winter. She'd been exploring, as was her habit when weather permitted, and she'd found a series of limestone caves about halfway up the mountain behind their claim. When she stepped inside the largest one, just to escape the wind for a moment, she felt something unexpected. The temperature inside was noticeably different from outside, not warm exactly, but stable, unchanging, like the cave existed in its own separate season that had nothing to do with what was happening in the world beyond its mouth. Thomas had listened, interested, but not entirely convinced of what she was suggesting, which was that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way to winter than burning yourself out, trying to heat a wooden box in the middle of a frozen wilderness. After Thomas died, crushed by a collapsed mineshaft timber in April of 1884, Sarah found herself alone on that claim with a choice to make. She could return east, back to Pennsylvania where her sister lived, or she could stay and try to make it through another winter on her own. The neighbors, especially Martha Harris, urged her to leave before the snow came. A woman alone, they said, wouldn't survive. She'd freeze to death or starve, or worse, go mad from the isolation. But Sarah had something in mind that she couldn't quite shake loose. That cave she'd found kept coming back to her thoughts. All through the summer, as she worked her small garden and tried to keep up the homestead, she kept walking back to that cave, standing at its entrance, stepping inside and feeling that strange, steady temperature that never seemed to change no matter how hot the day got outside. She started to understand something that the others hadn't considered. The earth itself, the mountain, was massive beyond any human scale, and that much rock and soil held a kind of stored temperature that didn't fluctuate with the seasons the way the air did. If she could live inside that mass, inside that steady temperature, she might not need to fight against the winter at all. She might just need to exist within it, the way the mountain itself did. When she tried to explain this to Frederick Bauer one afternoon in late August, showing him the cave and describing her plan, he looked at her with genuine concern. Living in a cave, he said in his thick accent, was something desperate people did when they had no other choice. She had a cabin, a roof, walls. Why would she abandon that for a hole in the ground? She tried to explain about the stable temperature, about how the cave seemed to exist outside of winter, but he shook his head. "You need fire," he told her. "You need walls that keep the wind out. You need a proper home, not an animal den." He left, convinced she was making a terrible mistake, driven by grief into irrational thinking. Sarah stood at the cave entrance after he'd gone and made her decision. She would prove that observation and reason could be just as valuable as tradition. By early September, Sarah had begun the work in earnest. She spent weeks hauling materials up the mountainside, making trip after trip along the steep trail she'd worn into the slope. She brought her tools, her cooking supplies, her blankets and winter clothes, and then she started on the structural work itself. The cave was large, perhaps 20 paces deep, and a dozen wide at its broadest point, with a ceiling that rose higher than she could reach even standing on a stump. The entrance faced southeast, which gave her morning light but kept out the worst of the northwest wind that dominated the winter weather. Her first task was building a proper wall across the cave's mouth, and this is where her plan diverged most dramatically from traditional cabin construction. Instead of sealing the cave entirely, she built what amounted to a double wall with a substantial gap between the outer and inner barriers. She gathered stones from the mountain, hundreds of them, each one carried by hand or dragged on an old canvas tarp Thomas had left behind. The outer wall she built solidly, stacking stones carefully and filling gaps with a mixture of clay and small rocks. But she left several deliberate openings near the top and bottom, like windows without glass, just holes in the stonework. Then, about 3 feet inside the cave from that outer wall, she built a second wall of stone, again leaving openings, but positioned differently from the first wall's gaps. The space between these two walls formed a kind of chamber that ran the entire width of the entrance. The neighbors who saw her working, and several did make the climb out of curiosity or concern, could make no sense of what she was building. Samuel Harris visited in mid-October, before the first heavy snows, and stood looking at her double wall with complete bafflement. "Why build 2 walls," he asked, "when you barely needed one? Why leave holes in walls that were supposed to keep out the cold?" Sarah tried to explain, using comparisons she thought he might understand. "You wear 2 shirts in winter," she said, "not one thick one, because the air between them helps hold your warmth. The outer wall would catch the cold wind and slow it down, and the gap between the walls would create a buffer, a kind of cushion, where air could settle and warm slightly before entering the cave. The holes were positioned so air would have to wind its way through them in a zigzag path, rather than blowing straight through, losing most of its momentum and cold bite in the process. She was creating, though she didn't use these exact words, a barrier that worked by accepting cold air and slowing it down until it barely moved at all, rather than trying to stop it completely like a traditional wall did. Samuel listened but left, shaking his head. She was wasting energy, he thought, on something that wouldn't work when the real cold hit. Better to have sealed that cave tight and built the biggest fire she could manage. Through October and into early November, Sarah completed her entrance system and then turned to the interior. She built a small stone hearth well inside the cave, but notably smaller than what anyone would put in a cabin meant to heat itself through winter. She needed it for cooking and light, she reasoned, but not for survival warmth. She positioned her living space in the deepest part of the cave, where the temperature felt most stable, and arranged her belongings carefully, keeping everything off the cave floor by building simple platforms from timber she'd salvaged from her cabin. She brought up sacks of dried beans and corn, smoked meat from a deer she'd been fortunate enough to shoot, preserved vegetables from her garden, and enough supplies to see her through to spring if she was careful. The last thing she carried up, making 2 trips because of its weight, was Thomas's carpentry tools. She kept them not because she thought she'd need them, but because they were his, and she wasn't ready to let go of that connection. By late November, she was living in the cave full-time, having closed up the cabin below and accepting that she'd committed herself fully to this experiment in mountain dwelling. The first cold snap came in early December, a week of temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Sarah woke each morning in the darkness of the cave, lit a small fire for breakfast and warm water, and felt the cave's temperature settle into what she could only describe as cool but not cold, somewhere comfortable enough that she could move around in her wool dress without shivering, without that deep bone cold that had defined her previous winters in the cabin. She stepped outside several times that week, checking the outer wall and gathering snow to melt for water, and the contrast was immediate and striking. Outside was viciously, painfully cold, the kind of cold that burned your lungs and turned your face numb in moments. Inside the entrance wall system, in that gap between the double walls, the air was still cold, but noticeably calmer, as though the wind had given up its anger somewhere in the passage through her stone maze. And inside the cave itself, past the inner wall, the temperature held steady, unchanging whether it was midday or midnight, whether the sun was shining or a blizzard was howling outside. She found she could keep a small fire going in her hearth for cooking and comfort, burning through maybe 1/10 of the wood she would have needed in the cabin, and the cave remained perfectly livable. The rock walls, that massive thermal mass, as someone might say today, but which Sarah simply understood as the mountain's own stored warmth, gave back to the air inside the cave a steady, moderate temperature that felt like a mild autumn day rather than the dead of winter. Down at the Harris homestead and at Frederick Bauer's place, the early December cold sent everyone scrambling to their woodpiles. Samuel and Martha Harris found themselves going through wood at an alarming rate, keeping their fireplace roaring day and night, and still they woke to frost inside the cabin and wind that seemed to find every tiny gap in their walls. Martha wore every layer she owned and still shivered while preparing meals. The children huddled together at night under piles of blankets, and Samuel spent entire days doing nothing but cutting and splitting wood, knowing that if he fell behind even a little, they'd be in real danger. Frederick Bauer, living alone like Sarah, had better luck with his sawmill providing easy access to timber, but he too found himself feeding fire after fire, watching his carefully stacked cords of wood disappear at a pace that worried him. They all wondered, some with genuine concern and some with grim certainty that they'd been right, how Sarah Coleman was managing up in that cave. Most figured she'd already come to her senses and climbed back down to take shelter in her cabin, too embarrassed to admit her mistake. Some feared they'd find her frozen come spring. Sarah, for her part, spent December in relative comfort that seemed almost miraculous compared to her previous winter experiences. She developed a routine that required far less physical labor than cabin life had demanded. Each morning, she'd wake naturally, without the panic of checking if the fire had died, and she'd light a small cooking fire that warmed her immediate area pleasantly. She could read by firelight and candlelight, work on mending clothes or preparing food, even sit and think, without every moment being consumed by the desperate work of staying warm. She ventured outside when weather permitted, checking her snares and bringing in fresh snow for water, and each time she returned to the cave, she felt that same sense of entering a space that existed outside the tyranny of winter. The walls of the cave itself seemed to radiate a gentle, persistent warmth, not hot by any means, but stable and steady in a way that wood heat never was. Fire heat came in waves, hot when you stood near it, and cold when you moved away, always fluctuating as the fire rose and fell. The cave's temperature just was, unchanging, reliable, asking nothing of her except that she let it be what it was. What Sarah had created, though she'd never studied formal science and wouldn't have known the modern terminology, was a system that worked with natural principles rather than against them. The mountain itself was a vast reservoir of thermal energy collected over the warm months and stored in billions of tons of rock and soil. That stored energy didn't disappear when winter came. It sat there, stable, radiating inward toward the cave, at a rate so slow and steady it was essentially constant. The cave's interior, being surrounded by this massive heat reservoir, naturally settled into a temperature that reflected the average annual temperature of the region rather than the daily extremes. It was the same principle that kept root cellars cool in summer and kept springs flowing with water that felt warm compared to winter air, even though the water itself hadn't changed temperature. The double-wall entrance system she'd built worked like the layers of clothing she'd compared it to. The outer wall blocked direct wind and created a first buffer of still air. The inner wall created a second buffer, and the staggered openings forced air to move slowly and tortuously through the entrance system, giving it time to warm slightly through contact with the stone walls, which were themselves warmed by contact with the mountain. By the time cold air reached the main cave, it had been substantially moderated. The small fire she maintained added some heat, certainly, but its primary job was psychological comfort and practical cooking, not survival. The mountain itself was doing the real work of keeping her alive. The proof, the undeniable validation that would silence every skeptic, came in late January of 1885. Weather patterns had been building for weeks, and anyone who'd lived in the Rockies for any time knew the signs. The clouds came in thick and low, sitting on the mountain peaks like a suffocating blanket. The temperature dropped gradually but relentlessly, and the wind shifted to come straight down from the northwest, carrying with it air from the Arctic plains that felt sharp enough to cut exposed skin. Old-timers, the men who'd been in Colorado since the territorial days, called it the worst cold they'd seen in 2 decades. The storm, when it hit, buried the entire region under snow measured in feet rather than inches, and the temperature plunged to levels that made the early December cold seem almost pleasant by comparison. It was cold enough to freeze the sap inside standing trees, causing them to split with sounds like rifle shots in the night. It was cold enough that butter froze solid and could be sawed like wood. It was cold enough that going outside for more than a few minutes meant risking frostbite on any exposed skin, and staying outside for an hour without proper shelter meant dying. Inside her cave, Sarah felt the change in weather the way you might notice a slight breeze on a summer day, perceptible, but not concerning. The temperature in the main chamber dropped slightly, perhaps to what someone might call genuinely cool rather than mild, but it remained far above the killing cold that raged outside. She could still move around in normal winter clothing, still sleep under a reasonable number of blankets, still keep her small fire burning for cooking without needing to make it larger. She noticed the cold more at the entrance, where air from outside managed to penetrate further into the inner chamber than usual. But even there, it wasn't the brutal, life-threatening cold of the world beyond her stone walls. She spent her days quietly, reading from the Bible she'd brought, working through the mending pile she'd been putting off, and occasionally stepping into the entrance chamber to look out at the storm when it cleared enough to see anything beyond immediate whiteness. She was warm enough to sit comfortably for hours. She was using maybe an armload of wood every 3 days, so little that her modest supply stacked in the deeper part of the cave looked like it might last until summer. At the Harris homestead, the situation became desperate within days of the storm's full arrival. They burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days, keeping the fireplace roaring constantly and still watching frost form on the inside walls. Samuel worked himself nearly to collapse, hauling in more wood from the stacks outside, making trip after trip in conditions that left him gasping and numb. Martha kept the children in bed, piled under every blanket they owned, and even then they complained of the cold. Water froze in pots mere feet from the fire. The family slept in shifts, someone always tending the fire, because letting it die, even for an hour, might mean pipes freezing, might mean cold so deep inside the cabin they couldn't recover from it. Samuel's woodpile, which he'd calculated carefully to last through March, was disappearing at a rate that terrified him. At this pace, they'd be out of fuel by mid-February, with 6 more weeks of winter minimum to endure. Frederick Bauer fared somewhat better with his access to timber, but even he found himself working from dawn until dark, just to keep himself warm, his hands cracked and bleeding from the constant labor of cutting and splitting frozen wood. The moment of recognition came on a clear morning, 3 days after the worst of the storm had passed. Samuel Harris, driven by genuine fear for Sarah's survival and needing to confirm whether he'd need to dig a grave come spring, made the difficult trek up to the cave. He struggled through drifts higher than his waist, breaking trail for over an hour to cover what was normally a 30-minute walk. He arrived at the cave entrance expecting to find emptiness or worse, and instead he found Sarah sitting near the opening of her inner wall, working on embroidery and light that came through the entrance, wearing a simple wool shawl over her dress, like she was sitting in an autumn parlor rather than a mountain cave in the middle of the worst winter cold anyone could remember. She looked up when she heard him approaching, greeted him warmly, and invited him inside. Samuel stepped through the outer wall, then through the inner wall, and felt the change like walking from one world into another. The interior of the cave was comfortable, genuinely comfortable, warm enough that he immediately felt overdressed in all his heavy layers. He stood there, looking around at her neat living space, at the small fire in her hearth that couldn't possibly be producing enough heat to explain what he was feeling, at her stacked supplies that clearly showed she'd barely touched her winter stores. He looked at Sarah, healthy and calm and utterly unbothered by the killing cold that had his family huddling together for survival, and he understood with complete certainty that she'd been right, and every one of them had been wrong. The conversation that followed was quiet and profound. Samuel asked, with genuine humility, how she'd done it. Sarah walked him through the cave, explaining in simple terms what she'd observed and how she'd worked with it rather than against it. The mountain itself holds warmth, she said, like a store holds goods on its shelves. It doesn't go away just because winter comes. You just have to live inside that storage, inside that steadiness, rather than trying to create your own heat in a place where it wants to escape. The double wall, she explained, wasn't about keeping cold out entirely, but about slowing it down until it barely had any force left, like water from a flood spreading out over a meadow until it's just a gentle sheet you can wade through. Samuel understood, not with the scientific precision we might use today, but with the practical wisdom of someone who'd spent years fighting against cold and suddenly seeing that he'd been approaching the problem entirely wrong. He left that morning determined to tell the others, carrying in his mind the image of Sarah comfortable and warm, while the rest of them suffered, and knowing that her mockery, her seemingly mad decision to live in a cave, had been the wisdom of someone who'd paid closer attention than any of them to what the mountain itself was trying to teach. Within weeks, as word spread and the winter continued to punish those living in traditional cabins, Sarah received a steady stream of visitors, all coming to see the cave shelter for themselves and all leaving with the same expression of amazed realization. Frederick Bauer stood in her cave for nearly an hour, just feeling the temperature and looking at the walls as though they'd betrayed him by not teaching him this lesson earlier. Martha Harris came with her children, and Sarah shared hot tea with them in the comfortable warmth of the interior, watching the children relax and stop shivering for the first time in weeks. The conversation among the settlers shifted entirely. By February, 3 families had begun scouting the mountain for similar caves they might use, and by early spring, plans were being drawn for cave-based homesteads that would incorporate Sarah's double-wall entrance system and deep cave living quarters. The technique spread through practical demonstration and word of mouth, not through books or formal instruction, passed along as something that worked and could be proven by anyone willing to make the walk up to Sarah's cave and step inside to feel the difference for themselves. Sarah Coleman, the widow they'd pitied and mocked, had become the most sought-after advisor in the region for winter survival strategy. The cave served Sarah through that entire winter, and for 3 more winters after that. She eventually remarried in the spring of 1888, a mining engineer named Thomas Wright, who'd heard about her cave dwelling and came specifically to see it, arriving with plans and questions and staying long enough to fall in love. They built a proper home together, down in what had become a growing town, but they kept the cave maintained and used it occasionally when winter storms came through particularly fierce, enjoying the novelty of having such perfect shelter available. The cave itself, according to local records and stories passed down through families, remained in use as an emergency shelter and occasional residence for nearly 40 years. With Sarah's double-wall entrance system being maintained and improved by subsequent users. The final record of its use comes from 1924, when a young couple weathered a particularly harsh November storm there and left their names carved respectfully into the stone near Sarah's original hearth. After that, as modern heating systems and better construction techniques made cave dwelling unnecessary, the shelter was eventually abandoned to time, though local historians in Leadville today still point up toward that part of the mountain and tell the story of the widow who refused to accept that winter had to be suffered through, who looked at the mountain and saw something everyone else had missed. Sarah's story wasn't just about staying warm or surviving winter, or even about the specific technique of cave dwelling. It was about the profound power of observation over assumption, about questioning why things had to be done the way they'd always been done, about having the courage to look foolish in pursuit of an idea that made sense in ways others couldn't initially see. She'd recognized that fighting against winter's cold, trying to generate enough heat to overcome it through constant fire and effort, was a battle that exhausted people and consumed their whole lives for months at a time. She'd seen instead that working with the natural systems already present, the massive thermal stability of the mountain, the protective power of layered barriers that slowed rather than stopped cold air, could achieve better results with far less effort. In our time, with our central heating and insulated walls and thermostats, we've taken a different path, but we've also in some ways lost touch with that intimate understanding of how natural systems work, that close observation of the world that allowed someone like Sarah Coleman to see solutions that formal education might have missed. What makes this story resonate across the decades isn't just the cleverness of the solution or the historical curiosity of frontier life. It's the reminder that human ingenuity often emerges from necessity, combined with willingness to observe carefully and think independently. Sarah didn't have advanced degrees or access to research libraries. She had a survival problem, sharp observation skills, and the courage to act on her conclusions, even when everyone around her thought she was wrong. That combination, that willingness to trust your own reasoning and observations over the collective certainty of traditional wisdom, drives progress in every generation. The pioneers who settled the American frontier faced impossible challenges daily, and those who succeeded often did so, not by following rules, but by watching closely, thinking deeply, and trying solutions that seemed crazy until they proved themselves through results. Sarah Coleman's cave shelter is just one story among thousands of similar innovations, each one representing someone who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. If these stories of frontier ingenuity and practical wisdom speak to you the way they speak to us, if you find yourself thinking about Sarah Coleman's observation and courage, if you want to keep these memories of human resourcefulness alive and honored, then we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel and help us continue sharing these histories. Every like, every comment sharing your own family stories of innovation and survival, every subscriber who wants to hear more of these accounts, helps ensure that Sarah and thousands like her aren't forgotten, that their cleverness and determination continue to inspire. These weren't just survival techniques, they were real lives lived with ingenuity and courage, and they deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us if your own family has stories of unconventional solutions to impossible problems, of someone who was mocked until they were proven right. We'd love to hear them, love to keep building this community of people who understand that the past has wisdom to teach if we're willing to listen. In the end, what Sarah Coleman proved on that mountain in 1884 was something simple but profound. Warmth doesn't always have to come from fire if you're willing to find it where the earth has stored it, and the wisdom to survive often comes from watching carefully, thinking differently, and having the courage to live by your own observations even when tradition says you're wrong. The mountain held its warmth through winter then, just as mountains still do now, waiting for anyone patient enough to notice and wise enough to listen.